It's very nice to be able to show that in Donegal because I actually made it with Orla Murphy, a Donegal-based artist, and I'm sure if she knew that I'm showing it in Donegal today, she'd be delighted. Thank you very much, Charlie, for working the technology. Brilliant, thank you. And it's lovely to be here. I always hear about MacGill Summer School on the radio over the summer. It's a bit like the GAA. You know, it's one of those sounds you associate with the summer. So it's lovely to finally be here. I'll go fairly quickly now, I think, so because I know we're tight for time. Excuse me. Okay. So my research into the morphology and the future of Irish rural towns began 7 years ago. Ireland had just witnessed an extraordinary expansion of its stock of housing and associated suburban and commercial development. Between 2006 and 2008, 223,170 new dwellings were built. By September 2008, development had ground to a halt and a tide of construction activity receded rapidly, leaving in its wake almost 300,000 vacant houses and apartments. Between 2009 and 2011, I carried out fieldwork surveys of 4 case study Irish rural towns. One of the themes that I mapped was housing. I studied and mapped the typology and the distribution of dwellings in Bandon, New Ross, Westport, and Longford. Despite being morphologically distinct, each town demonstrated similar recent development. They show the dual phenomena of suburban expansion and increasing town core vacancy. If we look, for example, at Longford, you can see that the recent suburbanisation began to dwarf the core of the town. Suburban housing is shown here in purple, and you can see it's the same size as the existing main core of Longford. Overzoning of agricultural land outside of the town for residential use had prompted the development of housing estates which followed pre-existing field boundaries rather than a spatially coherent plan to extend the town. Isolated clusters of housing with no connection to the multifunctional and diverse centres relied on movement by car to peripheral shops. Schools followed suit, locating on out-of-town sites to facilitate large areas of car parking. Changes in the creation of space on the periphery of towns resulted in a steady vacation of town core streets. As part of the dissemination stage of the research that I did, I brought the book that I wrote and the short film that we've just watched around several rural towns, and I spoke about my findings. Town core vacancy was always a priority for people in every town I visited. Communities were baffled by the construction of often unneeded housing outside of their towns, in parallel with steadily increasing vacancy of buildings within the centre of the town. The recent recession has given us all time to reflect and, I think, conclude that the planning system in its current form has failed towns in the last 20 years. It's a system that has facilitated a spread of car-dependent housing on the outside of towns, punctuated by nodes of large-scale retail space arranged around distributor roads. It has rejected the concept of the town as a compact urban system, with the result that the valuable resources of people, water, energy and transport have been stretched over an unnecessarily dispersed area. We needed to learn from those mistakes in order to better design the future spatial development of the urban fabrics of our towns in a way that would promote equitable and viable access to space, amenity, culture, community, education and work. So almost 7 years on from the economic crash, many rural towns in Ireland are still struggling. Large supermarkets on the outskirts have stymied small retailers whose rents, rates and increased regulations make it financially unviable to stay in business. Living above the shop is currently neither very attractive or affordable. Heritage and special conservation area status and recently introduced building control regulations have made it harder and much more expensive to reuse, retrofit and adapt existing buildings. The current advertising campaign that you may have seen by Guinness and the GAA has unintentionally highlighted the plight of many contemporary rural towns. The billboard campaign consists of these beautiful large-scale photographs by Alex Telfer depicting dramatically lit rural towns at dusk. Each image shows part of a football or hurling pitch, a set of goalposts or forgotten ball. The pitches are shown in the context of their town, light coming from the windows, signifying occupation and activity behind. Of course, the message is that the strength behind every town is the GAA, and that after the game is played, we all go to the pub and chat and relax over a pint and discuss the game. But the touched-up windows in these photographs resonate very awkwardly because the real Cahersiveen or Ballinrobe or Tulsk or Callan streets that we pass through after dark are in fact devoid of life. And in reality, there are no lights shining from the windows because nobody is home. We may be hearing less about ghost estates now, but their legacy persists. Counties with the highest residential vacancy rates include Leitrim, Donegal, Longford and Cavan, counties that were designated for development tax incentives in the absence of any evidence-based housing need during the boom years. Leitrim tops the table with over 30% of its housing stock recorded as vacant, and Donegal isn't very far behind. These figures come from Rob's Aero research. So what role can rural towns play in solving Ireland's current housing crisis? This depends on whom you ask, but from the available evidence, the answer is currently very little. Last year, the Housing Agency issued its report, Housing Supply Requirement in Ireland's Urban Settlements 2014 to 2018, which concluded that an average of 16,000 units per annum are required across urban settlements during the next 4 years, of which, as Conor was referring to earlier, 47% are required across the Dublin region's urban settlements. So in fact, very little new housing is required in many urban settlements outside of the Greater Dublin region. The report asserts that no new housing is required within Leitrim or Longford within the life of the report, and very little is required in Roscommon, Sligo, Kerry, Monaghan, Cavan, Donegal or Mayo. Each of these counties, as has been recently discussed, writes its own development plan and detailed housing strategy. And yet all the local authorities of these counties have continued to overzone former agricultural land for residential use, some, as these figures suggest, by staggering amounts. And all of these counties still contain a bank of unfinished housing estates. If you look very briefly at Roscommon, you'll see that they have currently need 139 new houses within the lifetime of the Housing Agency report. They've zoned a massive 1,315 hectares of agricultural land for residential use, and they still have 55 unfinished housing estates. Plus, they've got 23% of their existing housing is vacant. Shocking. There are currently a total of 2,019,000 housing units in Ireland. That's one house for every 2.27 people. Strictly speaking, we currently have an adequate supply of housing for the population of this country. Unfortunately, they're not located where they're most needed. And while there may be a shortage of housing supply in parts of Dublin, this is definitely not the case in the rest of the country. We're currently seeing an emergence of two Irelands. The Greater Dublin region, which acts as an attractor for investment, people and economic activity, and then the rest of the country, which is finding it hard to hold on to its population base. The interests of neither one is served by this increasing polarisation. Now, it should be acknowledged that recent development plan policy documents for most counties recognise the increasing vacancy within town cores and the need to strengthen the existing town fabric through sequential development. But these written objectives are pointless if agricultural fields remain zoned for residential suburban expansion of towns in the absence of a coherent urban spatial design strategy. Once an agricultural piece of land is rezoned for residential use, it's developed as an independent parcel, disconnected from its urban centre and the streets and public places. Its design is dictated by engineering rules covering setback distances, minimum garden sizes and turning circles. Developers naturally aim to maximise the number of houses that they can obtain per site to get a return on their investment. And as Patrick Shaffrey mentioned earlier, houses are basically a cash crop in that scenario. As Christine Boyer writes in her essay, The Return to Aesthetics of Planning, increasingly fragmented elements of the city or town are planned or redeveloped as autonomous elements with little relationship to the whole and with direct concern only for adjacent elements. So much for the diagnosis of the current ill health of Irish rural towns, but what can be done to help their future recovery? So I propose 5 simple steps this afternoon. Firstly, the current 2-dimensional text and map-based development plans could be replaced with dynamic 3-dimensional development models, which are urban design-based and then planning policy supported. Secondly, field-by-field expansion of towns, I believe, should be discontinued immediately. If it's decided upon the evidence of need that urban cores need to expand beyond their current limits, development should be planned and designed in a sequential, spatially multifunctional way and in relation to the overall urban system of blocks, streets, plots and public space. An example of where this approach has worked is in the neighbourhood of Accordia in Cambridge. Thirdly, communities in rural towns should be part of the strategic development of their town. By this, I don't mean tokenistic community workshops where lip service is paid to consult with invited members of the community, but real, continual, long-term and focused engagement. One town which is adopting this approach is Callan in County Kilkenny. Nimble Spaces, which is run by Rosie Lynch and Holly Kearns, together with Patrick Lydon of the Callan Camphill community, are at present collaborating with town residents, Camphill clients, artists and experts on a co-housing initiative for Camphill service users, which is it's a really interesting housing model. And in Mulranny, County Mayo, the local Community Futures Group, in collaboration with UCD Architecture, is going to host Ireland's first geodesign workshop this September, as the next step in its preparation for its new Community Futures plan. Now, different towns are going to need different responses, but bespoke pilot projects could be established in a cross-section of rural towns, engaging local communities, property owners, urban designers, architects and planners to analyse the major issues at stake in their town and to respond with evidence-based and spatially tested strategies for the medium and long term. With a set of clear goals, communities can be empowered to deliver them, supported by their local authorities. Fourthly, in order to prevent a repeat of the same mistake of recent years, I believe we need to shift our objectives from ones which see vacant buildings and brownfield sites as being awkward to develop, to ones which see these existing buildings as valuable assets, resources to be used to their greatest potential. The key to dealing with the regeneration of our rural towns, almost finished, is the imaginative reuse of existing urban fabric. Our planning system should do everything in its power to support this. I'm going to skip over that. A good example of temporary reuse can be seen in Culture Structure's temporary performance space in Callan, which reused an existing vacant space in the town and added to the culture and life of the town. And lastly, vacant space within towns should be audited, which was something in the National Spatial Strategy, believe me or not, I actually read it, and a real-time model used to incentivise reuse of existing building stock. The Heritage Council's recommended rollout of the Living Towns initiative should be implemented across all rural towns, not just our major cities. Equally, a vacant building tax within towns would encourage occupation of existing buildings. Pilot urban design projects could be supported by local government to examine new ways to stitch living, working, commercial and social amenities together to promote high design standards, energy efficiency and urban resilience principle. In conclusion, I just want to refer to John Healy, who wrote a chilling account of the abandonment of Charlestown, County Mayo in 1968. The book was a collection of columns he'd written for the Irish Times that were later published together under the title No One Shouted Stop. Healy repeatedly regrets that with each ebbing of the population, it was greeted with apathy instead of a clear cry of stop. We're now at another crucial point in the spatial, cultural and social definition of this country, and faced with the simple question, do we value our rural towns enough to want them to survive? If the answer is no, it would be better maybe to put withering towns out of their misery and just let them go. In the words of that KBC bank customer who says online, I do my shopping online, work online, met my boyfriend online, split up online. Cities are there for big things like universities, shows, restaurants, work, your 20s, and then for everything else there's Google. Or do we value towns as sustainable urban settlements that have the potential to offer the best of urban life with ease, proximity, social cohesion and community that large cities sometimes find hard to maintain? Do we value towns as vessels of rural culture and ritual, whereby being closer together, culture is somehow condensed and clearer? Do we value the potential to exchange goods and services with people that we know, who actually make things, who value quality? Do we value the ability of our children to be an active part of the physical and social fabric of community? Do we value well-designed urban spaces and buildings as a framework for rural community and culture? If the answer is yes, we need to take concrete action to address the increasing polarity between cities and rural towns. Rural towns are resilient, but they need a helping hand to recover and better planning systems in order to grow. So I'm going to leave you with this quote. I was going to read it out, but I know we're pressed for time, so I'll just let you digest it yourself. And let's please not let another chance to shout stop pass us by. Thank you very much.